The wind was a blade against her scalp. It carried the scent of dust and distant, indifferent pines, a smell Alara had once loved and now associated only with abandonment. Cold seeped through the coarse wool of the horse blanket, a poor shield against the late autumn chill that had settled deep in her bones. She sat huddled on the frozen ground, knees drawn to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the high plains. Beside her, Cora shivered, a small, bird-like creature lost in a matching blanket, her whimpers stolen by the ceaseless gale. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, crawling sensation over her naked head, more chilling than the wind itself. Every gust felt like a phantom touch, tracing the crude, shorn path of the shears, rediscovering the humiliation. She did not need a mirror to see the words. She could feel them, branded into her consciousness, a foul epitaph scrawled in charcoal across her forehead and chorus. Unwanted burden. The grit of the charcoal had been rough against her skin as Preacher Thorne's wife scraped the letters on, her knuckles bony and unforgiving. The words were for the world to see, a proclamation of their uselessness, a justification for their exile. They had been cast out from the town of Providence, driven from the only home they had ever known, their small farm now belonging to the church, to God, as the preacher had said. But Alara knew God had no need for their 24 chickens and the fallow potato field. Preacher Thorne, however, did. A shadow fell over them, long and stark in the low-slung afternoon sun. Alara flinched, pulling the blanket tighter, a useless instinct to hide what was already so brutally exposed. She did not look up. To look up was to invite notice, and notice was the precursor to pain. She held her breath, praying the shadow would pass, that it was just a trick of the light, a cloud moving across the sun. But it remained a solid, breathing presence. She could hear the soft stamp of a horse's hoof, the creak of worn leather. Cora's whimpering ceased, replaced by a sharp, terrified silence. The silence was worse. It was a held breath, a world waiting for the next blow to fall. Alara risked a glance, not at the figure but at the ground. She saw the dusty, scuffed toes of a man's boots. Worn, but well cared for. They were still patient, not the impatient, stomping boots of the men from Providence who had dragged them from their house. This stillness was different, unnerving in its quietude. Minutes stretched into an eternity, measured by the frantic pounding of her own heart. The wind howled its lonely song. Finally, a sound broke the tension, not a voice, but the gentle clink of a canteen being unhooked from a saddle. The boots took 2 slow steps forward. The canteen was placed on the ground between them, close enough to reach, but not so close as to be a threat. Another sound, the rustle of a canvas sack, and a small, cloth-wrapped bundle landed softly beside the canteen. Then the shadow retreated. The sound of creaking leather, the soft snore of the horse, and the slow, deliberate tread of hooves moving away. Alara waited until the sound had faded completely, until she was certain the man was gone. Only then did she dare to lift her head. A lone rider was receding into the vastness, a dark speck against the pale, bruised sky. He did not look back. Her eyes fell to the offerings on the ground, water and food, a simple, profound gesture that defied the cruelty etched onto her skin. Her hand, trembling, reached for the canteen. The metal was cold. She unscrewed the cap and brought it to Cora's lips first, tilting it gently. Her little sister drank in desperate, gulping swallows. Then Alara drank, the water a shock of life in her dry throat, washing away some of the dust, but not the bitterness, not the shame. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a hunk of dry bread and a piece of salted meat. It was more than they had eaten in 2 days. She broke the bread, her movements stiff and clumsy, and gave a larger piece to Cora. As they ate, chewing slowly, mechanically, the sun dipped below the horizon, pulling the last of the day's warmth with it. The world bled into shades of gray and deep, starless violet. The man was gone, but his presence lingered in the silence, in the life-giving water and bread. He had seen them. He had seen the shorn heads, the vile words, the depths of their degradation. And he had not jeered, had not judged, had not turned away in disgust. He had simply left them sustenance and dignity. In the encroaching dark, huddled together against a world that had branded them worthless, that small act of humanity was a flicker of fire in an endless, freezing night. It was not hope, not yet. It was something far more fragile and elemental, survival. The man returned with the dawn. Alara had not slept, her senses stretched taut, listening to the night's desolate symphony of wind and coyotes. She saw him from a long way off, a silhouette emerging from the pearlescent mist clinging to the plains. This time, he led a second horse, a sturdy-looking mare with an empty saddle. He did not ride directly to them, stopping a respectful distance away, dismounting with a fluid economy of motion. He stood by his horse, waiting. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, weathered buckskin and canvas. His face, shadowed by the brim of a low-crowned hat, was unreadable. He made no sound, no gesture of summons. He simply was, an unmovable part of the landscape, patient as a weathered stone. The choice was theirs. To stay was to perish from cold or starvation, a slow, anonymous death on the prairie. To go with him was to step into the unknown, to place their lives in the hands of a stranger who had seen their deepest shame. She looked at Cora, whose small face was pale with cold and fear, her eyes huge and trusting, fixed on Alara. In that moment, Alara understood the true weight of the words scrawled on her skin. She was not just a burden, she was a guardian. The man had offered them a chance, and it was a greater risk to refuse it than to accept. With a resolve that felt foreign and brittle, she rose to her feet, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders like a queen's mantle. She helped Cora up, whispering, "It's all right. We're going with him." The man watched them approach, his expression unchanging. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod as she reached him. He did not offer a hand to help her mount the mare, but simply held the bridle steady, a silent expectation that she was capable. Alara, who had ridden since she could walk, gathered the reins and swung herself into the saddle. She reached down for Cora, pulling her up to sit in front of her, enveloping the small, shivering body with her own. She wrapped the blanket around them both, a cocoon of scratchy wool. Only when they were settled did the man mount his own horse. He turned his mount and started off at a slow, steady walk, never looking back to see if they followed. He did not need to. Where else could they go? They rode for hours, the landscape unchanging in its harsh beauty. The silence between them was vast and absolute, broken only by the plod of hooves and the cry of a lone hawk circling high overhead. Alara watched the man's back. It was a straight, unyielding line. He seemed to know this empty land intimately, navigating by instinct, following invisible trails. She tried to glean something of his character from his posture, from the way he held the reins, from the sparse collection of gear strapped to his saddle, but he remained an enigma. Her fear had not vanished. It had simply settled into a low, watchful hum beneath the surface of her exhaustion. Every stranger was a potential threat, every kindness a possible deception. The town of Providence had taught her that. Yet, his actions contradicted her suspicion. He had not bound their hands. He had not spoken a single word, kind or cruel. His silence was a blank canvas onto which she projected her own fears and a desperate, flickering ember of hope. They arrived at his home as dusk began to bleed across the sky. It was not a farm, not a ranch, but a small, solid cabin built of thick, hand-hewn logs, nestled in a shallow basin protected by a stand of gnarled junipers. It looked as if it had grown from the earth itself, solitary and self-contained. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a welcome sight against the darkening horizon. He dismounted and led the horses to a small, lean-to stable. Again, he waited for her to dismount on her own, a silent acknowledgement of her ability. He took the horses and, with a slight motion of his head, indicated the cabin door. Alara slid from the saddle, her legs stiff and numb, and helped Cora down. She stood for a moment, her gaze fixed on the closed door. This was the threshold. On the plains, there was a terrifying freedom. Inside that cabin, they would be under his roof, subject to his rules, his whims. The wind seemed to whisper the words from her memory, a taunting echo. Unwanted burden. She pushed the thought away. She took Cora's small, cold hand, squeezed it, and walked toward the door. It was made of heavy, split logs, with a simple leather latch. Her hand hesitated for a second before she pushed it open and stepped inside, into the firelight and the unknown. The interior was as stark and functional as the man himself. It was a single room, clean and orderly. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within, casting dancing shadows. A rough-hewn table with 2 benches, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves holding a spare collection of tins and jars. There was no clutter, no softness, no sign of another human presence. It was the home of a man who lived alone and expected nothing from the world but what he could take with his own 2 hands. He entered behind them, closing the door and shutting out the growing cold. He moved to the fire, adding a log from a neat stack beside the hearth. The flames flared, illuminating his face for the first time. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes. They were gray eyes, clear and direct. He looked at them, truly looked at them, his gaze lingering for a moment on their shorn heads. Alara braced herself for a comment, a question, a flicker of pity or disgust. But there was nothing. His expression remained neutral, unreadable. He simply turned away, moving to a pot simmering over the fire. He ladled a thick, savory-smelling stew into 2 wooden bowls and set them on the table. He gestured for them to sit. There were no more words than there had been on the plains. There was only the stew, the warmth of the fire, and the profound, echoing silence of a man who dealt in actions, not pronouncements. Days bled into a slow, quiet rhythm, measured not by a clock but by the rising and setting of the sun. The man, whom Alara and Cora came to know only as Silas, was a creature of habit and silence. He rose before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm. He would tend to the horses, check his traps, and return with game or firewood. He ate his meals at the rough table, his movements deliberate, his focus absolute. He never spoke unless it was a necessity, and even then his words were spare, clipped. More wood, he might say, or, storms coming, he never asked about their past, never mentioned the town of Providence, never acknowledged the humiliating words that had long since been scrubbed from their skin but were still carved into Alara's memory. His silence was a strange kind of gift. It allowed the raw wounds of their shame to be left undisturbed, to begin the slow, painful process of scarring over without the salt of questions or pity. Alara's initial fear of him began to recede, replaced by a cautious, watchful curiosity. She observed him the way one might observe a hawk, studying his habits, learning his patterns, trying to understand the nature of the creature with whom they shared this small, isolated space. She noted the meticulous care he took with his rifle, cleaning and oiling it by the firelight each evening. She saw the way he mended a tear in his own buckskin shirt with small, precise stitches that were surprisingly neat. She watched him split logs with a powerful, efficient grace, each swing of the axe finding its mark. There was no wasted motion in him, no wasted energy. He was a man who understood survival not as a battle, but as a discipline. At first, she and Cora remained huddled by the fire, 2 small islands of misery in the quiet cabin. They took up as little space as possible, spoke only in whispers when Silas was out. The cabin was his territory, and they were merely guests, or perhaps prisoners, existing on his sufferance. But the instinct for purpose, for usefulness, was a deeply ingrained thing. It was the opposite of being a burden. One morning, after Silas had left for his trap lines, Alara found a worn broom by the door. On impulse, she began to sweep the floorboards. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. It was an action she could control, a small pocket of order she could create in a world of chaos. She swept the dust and stray bits of wood from the floor, her movements becoming more confident with each pass. Cora, seeing her sister at work, found a rag and began to carefully wipe down the table. They did not speak of it, but it was a turning point. They were no longer just waiting. They were participating. When Silas returned, he paused in the doorway, his keen eyes taking in the swept floor, the clean table. He said nothing. He did not praise them or acknowledge the change in any overt way. He simply set down the brace of rabbits he carried, nodded once, and went about his business. But Alara felt a subtle shift in the air. His silence no longer felt like a void. It felt like acceptance. It was an unspoken understanding that they could contribute, that they could earn their keep not through obligation, but through shared existence. She began to take on other small tasks. She learned where he kept the mending kit and, with fingers still clumsy from disuse, began to repair the small rips and tears in their own meager clothing. She found a rhythm in darning socks, in reinforcing a worn seam on Cora's dress. Each stitch was an act of defiance against the narrative that had been forced upon them. A burden does not mend. A burden does not sweep. A burden does not contribute to the careful order of a home. She started to pay closer attention to his work as well. When he brought in the rabbits, she watched as he skinned and dressed them with practiced efficiency. The next time he brought in game, she held out her hand for the knife. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw not a plea, but a quiet statement of intent. After a moment's hesitation, he passed the knife to her, handle first. Her hands were cold and trembled slightly as she took it. The first attempt was messy, awkward. Her father had taught her once, a long time ago, but her hands had forgotten the feel of the work. Silas did not interfere. He did not correct or criticize. He simply sat by the fire, sharpening another blade, allowing her the dignity of the struggle. He allowed her to fail and to learn. By the time she was finished, her hands were bloody and her work was a poor imitation of his own, but the rabbit was ready for the pot. She had provided. It was a small, visceral victory, but it was hers. That night, as they ate the stew she had helped prepare, the silence at the table felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet of people sharing a space, a meal, a life. It was the beginning of a foundation built not on words, but on the solid, reliable bedrock of action. The sickness came upon Cora suddenly, a thief in the night. One evening she was listless, pushing her stew around her bowl, and by morning she was burning with a fever that left her small body trembling beneath the thin blankets. The heat radiating from her skin was a terrifying echo of the past, a ghost of the fever that had claimed their parents less than a year ago. Alara's carefully constructed composure shattered. The memory was so vivid, so visceral. The scent of sickness in their small farmhouse, the helpless look in her father's eyes, the final, rattling breaths of her mother. The same fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her now, paralyzing her. She bathed Cora's forehead with a cool, damp cloth, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow and frantic even to her own ears. But the fever did not break. Cora's breaths grew shallow, and she began to murmur deliriously, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Panic, stark and absolute, seized Alara. She was 16 years old, an outcast with a shaved head, and her sister was dying in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. All her small acts of defiance, the sweeping and the mending and the skinning of the rabbit, felt like childish games in the face of this real, terrifying threat. She was powerless. She needed help. Silas had been gone since before dawn, checking a line of traps he had set farther up the ridge. Alara found herself pacing the small cabin like a caged animal, her gaze constantly flitting from Cora's flushed face to the closed door. Every creak of the logs, every howl of the wind, sounded like his returning footsteps, and yet he did not come. The helplessness was a suffocating weight. She had been so determined to prove she was not a burden, to be self-sufficient, but now she would have given anything, swallowed any amount of pride, to have him there. When the door finally opened late in the afternoon, letting in a blast of frigid air, Ilara nearly collapsed with a mixture of terror and relief. Silas stood there, a brace of ptarmigan in one hand, his face etched with the cold. He stopped short when he saw her expression, his eyes immediately going to the cot where Cora lay. He took in the scene in an instant. The basin of water, the pale, sweat-sheen face of the child, Ilara's wide, panicked eyes. For the first time, she spoke to him without being spoken to, her voice cracking, desperate. "She's sick. It's a fever. I don't know what to do," he did not answer. He dropped the birds by the door, shedding his outer coat and hat as he crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt beside the cot, his large, calloused hand gently resting on Cora's forehead. His touch was surprisingly light, his face grim with concentration. He felt the pulse at her neck, pulled back the blanket to listen to her breathing. He was no doctor, but it was clear he was familiar with the signs of illness, the grim mathematics of survival in this harsh land. After a long moment, he rose. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw something other than stoic neutrality in his gray eyes. It was not pity, but a shared seriousness, a flicker of empathy that acknowledged the depth of her fear. "Willow bark," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And Yarrow, stay with her." He grabbed a small leather pouch from a shelf in his coat and was gone again, back out into the biting wind. Ilara was left alone once more, but the panic had subsided, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. He had not dismissed her fear. He had given her an order, a purpose, stay with her. And he had a plan. He was not abandoning them to their fate. He was fighting it alongside her. He returned as dusk fell, his hands full of stripped bark and a cluster of dried, feathery leaves. He moved to the hearth, crushing the ingredients with the handle of his knife, his movements quick and sure. He brewed a dark, bitter-smelling tea, letting it steep over the low flames. When it was ready, he poured a small amount into a cup and brought it to the cot. "Help me," he said. Together, they gently lifted Cora's head. Ilara held her sister, cradling her against her chest, while Silas carefully spooned the potent brew into her mouth. Cora, lost in the fog of fever, coughed and struggled weakly, but they managed to get most of it down. For the rest of the night, they kept a silent vigil. Ilara bathed Cora's face and hands, while Silas kept the fire fed and brewed more tea. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Their shared purpose filled the small cabin, a silent, powerful current flowing between them. He sat on a low stool by the fire, his rifle across his knees, a silent guardian. She sat on the edge of the cot, never letting go of Cora's hand. In the deep, quiet hours before dawn, watching the steady rise and fall of her sister's chest, Ilara felt a profound shift. The barrier between her and this silent man had dissolved, washed away by a shared crisis. He was no longer just her rescuer, a stoic enigma. He was her partner in this desperate fight. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, her most terrified, and had met her not with judgment, but with yarrow and willow bark, with the steady, grounding presence of his quiet strength. The fever broke just before sunrise. It receded like a tide, leaving Cora weak and spent, but blessedly cool to the touch. She slept a true, deep sleep for the first time in 2 days, her breathing even and soft. The relief that washed over Ilara was so immense it left her dizzy. She looked over at Silas, who was still on his stool by the fire, his posture unchanged. His eyes were on her, and in the pale morning light, she saw the exhaustion in his face. He gave a single, slow nod, an acknowledgement of their shared victory. The gesture was more eloquent than 1,000 words. In the days that followed, as Cora slowly regained her strength, the atmosphere in the cabin was irrevocably altered. The fragile trust forged in the crucible of Cora's illness had solidified into something deeper, more resilient. It was a bond woven from unspoken understanding and mutual reliance. Silas began to include Ilara in his world in small, significant ways. He no longer simply left her to her chores inside the cabin. One morning, as he was preparing to check his traps, he paused at the door and looked at her. "Come," he said. It was not a command, but an invitation. Alara bundled a still weak Cora in blankets by the fire and followed him out into the crisp, cold air. He led her away from the cabin, up a shallow, wooded draw where the snow lay in sheltered patches. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his senses attuned to the world around him. He pointed to a set of tracks in the snow. "Deer," he said, his voice low. He knelt, showing her how the depth of the print indicated the animal's weight, how the splayed toes suggested it was moving quickly. He pointed out a broken twig, the bark stripped from sapling. He was teaching her to read the silent language of the wilderness, a language he was fluent in. It was a transfer of knowledge, a bestowal of power. He was not just feeding her. He was teaching her how to feed herself. Over the next weeks, these lessons continued. He showed her how to identify the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant, even in its dried winter state. He taught her which mushrooms that grew on fallen logs were safe to eat and which were poison. He took her to his trap lines, showing her the subtle art of placing a snare, how to read the terrain to predict an animal's path. He was arming her with skills, with competence. He was giving her the tools to survive in this world on her own terms. One afternoon, he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a familiar, rhythmic sound. Alara was mending one of Cora's stockings. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. Silas finished his task, then reached into a small wooden box he kept on the mantelpiece. He pulled out a knife. It was not his own large skinning knife, but a smaller, more practical blade with a simple, unadorned wooden handle. The steel was clean and sharp. He held out to her, handle first, just as he had with the skinning knife. But this was different. This was not a tool to be borrowed for a single task. He was giving it to her. Alara put down her sewing, her heart beating a little faster. She reached out and took the knife. The weight of it was solid and real in her palm. It fit her hand perfectly. She looked up at him, her eyes questioning. "A tool," he said, his gaze direct. "To be used, not to be feared." It was the longest sentence he had ever spoken to her. A tool, not a weapon, though it could be one. It was a symbol of self-reliance, of capability. It was his acknowledgement that she was no longer the helpless victim he had found on the plains. He saw the strength that was beginning to take root in her, and he was nurturing it. She closed her hand around the handle, the smooth wood warming to her touch. She did not say thank you. The words felt inadequate, hollow. Instead, she met his gaze and gave him a small, determined nod. It was a promise. She would learn to use it. She would not be helpless again. She would not be a burden. The girl with the shaved head was gone. In her place was someone else, someone new, someone holding a knife. The past arrived on a steel-gray afternoon, a harbinger of trouble riding a tired-looking roan. Alara was outside, splitting kindling with a small hatchet, a task Silas had recently taught her. The rhythmic thud of the blade against wood was satisfying, a measure of her own growing competence. Her hair was beginning to grow back, a soft, dark down that blurred the harsh lines of a shorn scalp, a visible sign of healing. She had almost allowed herself to believe they were safe, that the world of Providence and Preacher Thorne was a nightmare from which they had awoken. Then she saw him, a lone rider, silhouetted on the low ridge that marked the edge of Silas's isolated valley. He was too far away to make out his features, but she did not need to. The rigid posture, the way he sat his horse, as if he owned the very land beneath it, it screamed of Providence. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her, undoing weeks of progress in a single heart-stopping moment. Her breath caught in her throat. The hatchet felt heavy and useless in her hand. She was frozen, a rabbit caught in the open, her eyes fixed on the distant, menacing figure. The rider surveyed the valley for a long, agonizing minute before turning his horse and disappearing back over the ridge. He was gone, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air. She ran back to the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the door, her face pale. Silas was at the table, sharpening the knife he had given her, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a calming sound that was now jarringly at odds with her terror. He looked up, and her expression was all the explanation he needed. He was on his feet in an instant, his face hardening into a mask of cold vigilance. "Where?" he asked, his voice flat. "The ridge," she managed to say, pointing. "A man on a horse." He was watching. Silas moved to the door and peered out, his body tense. He scanned the horizon for a long time, his eyes narrowed. The quiet, almost peaceful man she had come to know had vanished, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. The transformation was swift and absolute. He was a protector, a guardian of this small, solitary space, and that space had been breached. "Get inside. Stay away from the window," he commanded. His tone was not harsh, but it held an authority she had never heard before, and she obeyed without question. She pulled a shaken Cora away from her place by the fire and sat with her on the floor in the cabin's darkest corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her sister. The familiar sense of being hunted had returned, more potent for its absence. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Silas did not speak of the rider again that day, but the change in him was profound. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a taut, watchful quiet. Every gust of wind, every snap of a twig outside, made him pause, his head lifting, listening. That evening, he did not sit by the fire. He stood by the shuttered window, a dark sentinel peering through a tiny crack in the wood. He cleaned and loaded his rifle again, though it was already immaculate. He laid it on the table beside a pistol she had never seen before, its metal barrel gleaming dully in the firelight. The sight of the weapons, laid out with such deliberate purpose, made the threat feel terrifyingly real. They were no longer just hiding from a memory. They were preparing for an invasion. Sleep was impossible. Alara lay on her pallet, her eyes wide open in the dark, the knife Silas had given her clutched tightly in her hand under the blanket. The feel of its wooden handle was the only solid thing in a world that had once again dissolved into fear. Fragmented images of Providence assaulted her. The smug, righteous face of Preacher Thorne as he declared their farm forfeit. The cruel laughter of the townswomen as they held her down. The scrape of the shears against her scalp. But this time, another feeling mingled with the shame and terror. A cold, hard knot of anger. They had taken everything from her. Her parents, her home, her dignity. They had cast her and her sister out to die. And now, after she had found a fragile foothold of safety, they had come to drag her back into the darkness. A fierce, defiant spark ignited within her. They would not take this place. They would not take Cora. They would not take the new person she was becoming. She was not just a victim to be pitted or a burden to be discarded. She was a survivor, and survivors fought back. The story came out in ragged pieces the next day, pulled from her by the tense, waiting silence. Silas was barricading the single window with a thick plank of wood, his movements economical and grim. Alara sat at the table, watching him, the words tumbling out of her, a confession and an accusation all at once. She told him about Preacher Thorne, a man whose piety was a cloak for his avarice. She spoke of how, after the fever took their parents, Thorne had declared them orphans of God, their small farm a necessary tithe to ensure the town's salvation from the same sickness. He had used fear to stoke the town's greed. He said we were unclean, she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. That our parents' sickness was a punishment for some unknown sin, and that we carried the taint. She explained how Thorne had turned the community against them, his sermons painting them as a moral and financial liability. The final humiliation, the shearing, the charcoal branding, was a public spectacle, a ritual to purge the town of its unwanted burdens before casting them out. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to strip them of their identity and ensure no neighboring settlement would take them in. It was a death sentence, delivered with a prayer. As she spoke, she felt the last vestiges of her shame burning away, replaced by the clean, cold fire of rage. She was not unclean. She was wronged. Silas listened without interruption, his face a granite mask. The hammer strokes, as he secured the plank, were the only punctuation to her story. When she finished, the cabin was silent save for the crackle of the fire. He turned from the window, the interior of the cabin now dim and shadowy, lit only by the hearth. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a dangerous light she had never seen before. "They will come for the land," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He understood the root of it all was not piety but dirt. The small farm they had been driven from bordered this valley. Her presence here, alive and under his protection, was a threat to Thorne's claim. She was a loose end, a living testament to his crime. "He cannot allow you to survive," Silas continued, his voice low and hard. "You are proof of his lie." The truth of his words settled in her gut like a stone. This was not just about punishing runaways. This was about silencing a witness. This was about murder, sanctified by a stolen Bible. A wave of fear washed over her, but the anger held it at bay. She looked down at the knife in her lap, then back at Silas. "I will not hide in the corner this time," she said, her voice steady, imbued with a resolve that surprised even herself. She rose from the bench and walked to the wall where the hatchet was kept. She took it down. It was small, but the head was heavy, the edge sharp. She practiced swinging it, feeling its weight, its balance. Silas watched her, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in his eyes. He gave a curt nod. "The door is thick," he said, shifting from diagnosis to strategy. "They will come for the window first." "It is the weak point," he began to instruct her, his words spare and direct, a general laying out a field of battle. He showed her where to stand, how to use the limited space of the cabin to her advantage, how to use the darkness and the element of surprise. He was not training a soldier. He was honing a survivor's instinct, arming her with a plan to channel her anger and fear into effective action. As darkness fell, the cabin was transformed into a small, dark fortress. They ate a cold meal in the shadows, the silence thick with anticipation. Alara held her hatchet, Cora huddled behind her, her small hands clutching the back of Alara's dress. She was no longer the terrified girl from the plains. She was a defender of this small patch of ground, of her sister, of the new life she refused to surrender. She was ready. They came in the dead of night, under the sliver of a waning moon. 3 of them. Alara heard them first, the muffled crunch of boots on frozen ground, a sound that did not belong to the natural order of the wilderness. She was instantly awake, her heart leaping into a frantic, hammering rhythm. Beside her, Silas was already moving, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows by the hearth. He had not been sleeping. He had been waiting. He pressed a finger to his lips, though she had made no sound, and moved silently to his position beside the barricaded window. Alara's hand tightened on the handle of her hatchet. She scrambled to her feet, her movements practiced and quiet, and pulled a sleeping Cora behind a stack of firewood in the cabin's far corner, whispering for her to stay hidden no matter what she heard. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold, coiling serpent in her belly. But her anger was a shield against it. She took her place as Silas had instructed, flattened against the wall near the door, the heavy hatchet held ready. The silence outside stretched, taut, and agonizing. Then came a sharp, splintering crack. The first blow against the window barricade. It was followed by another, and another, the heavy thuds echoing the frantic beating of her own heart. A man's voice, low and guttural, cursed outside. Thick, another voice, higher-pitched and reedy with self-importance, cut through the night. "Break it down. He can't hide them forever. The Lord's work must be done, Preacher Thorne." The sound of his sanctimonious voice sent a fresh surge of cold fury through Alara. The wooden plank over the window shuddered, groaned, and then split with a deafening crack. A dark shape began to push its way through the shattered opening. In the same instant, the cabin exploded with the deafening roar of Silas's rifle. The shape in the window grunted a wet, choking sound and fell back into the night. A scream of pain and surprise erupted from outside. "He's armed," one of them yelled. The element of surprise was theirs. Before they could recover, Silas was already moving, a blur of motion in the dim firelight. He shoved the heavy table on its side, creating a barrier in the center of the room as another man tried to scramble through the broken window. The intruder landed in a crouch, a long knife gleaming in his hand. He was big, burly, one of Thorne's deacons. He lunged towards Silas, but he was clumsy and used to real violence. Silas met him not with the rifle, but with the cold, hard steel of the pistol. He did not fire. He moved with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold, sidestepping the man's rush and bringing the barrel of the pistol down hard on his wrist. The man howled as the knife clattered to the floor. Silas struck again, a swift, disabling blow to the side of his head. The man collapsed in a heap. It was then that the door burst open. Preacher Thorne stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Behind him, the third man, the one who had been at the window, clutched a bleeding arm. Thorne held a heavy horse pistol, its wide bore a dark. Menacing, I pointed directly at Silas. Blasphemer, harboring the unclean. Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. You will burn for this. Silas was across the room, his empty rifle his only shield. Thorne's attention was fixed entirely on him, on the man who had dared to defy his authority. He did not see the shadow detaching itself from the wall. He did not see Alara. In that split second, she was not thinking. She was pure, instinctual action. She saw the threat to Silas, to Cora, to everything. She lunged from the shadows, the hatchet held in both hands. She did not scream. Her fury was a silent, white-hot thing. She swung the hatchet not at Thorne, but at the hand holding the pistol, putting all of her weight, all of her rage into the blow. The heavy blade connected with a sickening crunch of bone. Thorne screamed, a high, unholy sound of pure agony, and the pistol clattered to the floor. He stared at his mangled hand, then at her, his eyes wide with shock and horror. He did not see a girl. He did not see a burden. He saw a fury he could not comprehend. Silas seized the moment, kicking the pistol away and driving his shoulder into Thorne's chest, sending him staggering back out into the night. The wounded man, seeing his leader fall, turned and fled into the darkness. Silas stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, and leveled his rifle at the whimpering preacher on the ground. He did not fire. He simply stood there, a silent, deadly judgment. Thorne, clutching his ruined hand, scrambled backward like a crab, then turned and fled, his righteous pronouncements replaced by pathetic sobs of pain. The night was suddenly, profoundly silent. The silence that descended after the flight of Thorne and his men was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the scent of gunpowder, splintered wood, and the coppery tang of fear. The cold night air poured in through the broken window and the open door, a stark reminder of their violated sanctuary. On the floor, the unconscious form of Thorne's deacon groaned, a low, pathetic sound. Alara stood in the center of the room, her knuckles white on the handle of the hatchet. Her arms trembled, not with fear, but with the violent aftermath of adrenaline. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked from the still form of the deacon to the dark, empty doorway, and then to Silas. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette against the pale moonlight, his rifle still held at the ready. He slowly lowered it, the tension draining from his shoulders. He turned, and his eyes found hers in the dim light. His gaze was intense, searching. He looked at her, at the hatchet still clutched in her hands, and at the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He saw not the cowering child he had found on the plains, but the woman who had charged from the shadows to save him. There was no praise in his eyes, no soft words of comfort. There was something far more valuable, a deep, quiet, unequivocal respect. He saw her, truly saw her, as an equal. He walked over to the deacon and, with a startling lack of ceremony, dragged the unconscious man out of the cabin and dumped him in the snow. He would wake to the cold and the shame of his failure. It was a mercy Thorne did not deserve. Silas returned, shutting the heavy door and dropping the bar into place. He moved to the hearth and added a log to the dying embers, coaxing them back to life. The growing light pushed back the shadows, revealing the chaos of the room, the overturned table, the shattered barricade, the scattered splinters of wood. Alara finally uncurled her fingers from the hatchet, her hand aching. She let it fall to her side with a soft thud. Her whole body felt boneless, exhausted. Cora peeked out from behind the woodpile, her eyes wide with terror. Alara rushed to her, kneeling and gathering her into a fierce hug. "It's over," she whispered, her voice rough. "We're safe." Silas turned from the fire. He looked at the two of them, huddled together, and then his eyes fell on Alara's hand. A long, shallow splinter of wood was embedded in her palm, a wound she hadn't even felt in the heat of the fight. He said nothing, but crossed to the shelf and came back with the small mending kit and a bottle of potent-smelling liniment. He knelt in front of her. "Hand," he said, his voice quiet. Hesitantly, she extended her hand. His large, rough fingers were surprisingly gentle as he examined the wound. He worked with the same focused precision he applied to everything, cleaning the cut and deftly removing the splinter with the tip of his knife. His touch was firm, steady, grounding her in the quiet reality of the cabin. As he wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her palm, their eyes met. The silence between them was no longer a void or a shared space of comfort. It was a testament. They had faced violence and death together, and they had prevailed. A bond forged in fire and fear, stronger than any words. He finished tying the bandage and gave her hand a slight, almost imperceptible squeeze before letting it go. It was an acknowledgement, a pact. The power dynamic had been shattered along with the window. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, melting the snow in patches and turning the hard, frozen earth to mud. The air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of damp soil and the promise of new life. The shattered window had been repaired, the scars on the doorframe the only physical reminder of that violent night. The scars within were deeper, but they too were beginning to heal. Alara's hair had grown into a short, thick cap of dark curls, framing a face that had lost its youthful softness and gained a quiet, steely resolve. She moved with a confidence that came from competence, no longer a guest in Silas's cabin, but a part of it, as integral as the stone hearth or the sturdy roof. The partnership forged in the crucible of Thorne's attack had settled into a comfortable, efficient rhythm. There were still few words between them, but they were no longer needed. They moved around each other with an innate understanding, a silent choreography of shared existence. When he went to hunt, she no longer stayed behind. She went with him, her own small knife at her belt, her eyes trained to read the landscape, her step as quiet and sure as his. He taught her to shoot the rifle, her small frame braced against its powerful kick, and she learned quickly, her aim steady and true. She was no longer simply learning to survive. She was learning to master her environment. One clear, cool morning, they stood together on the ridge where she had first seen the rider from Providence, the spot that had once been a symbol of her terror. Now, it was just a vantage point from which to view their valley. Below them, the cabin sat nestled in its basin, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney where Cora was tending the fire. The world felt vast and clean, washed new by the changing season. Alara looked out over the sprawling plains, the direction of the town she no longer thought of as home. It held no power over her now. The fear and shame were ghosts, faded memories of a person she no longer was. That girl, the one with the shaved head and the charcoal brand, had died that night in the cabin. She had been reborn in fire and fury, forged into something stronger, something that could not be broken. Silas stood beside her, his gaze also on the horizon. He had not changed. He was still the quiet, capable man he had always been. But she understood him now. His silence was not an absence of feeling, but a deep, abiding strength. His solitude was not born of misanthropy, but of a quiet refusal to participate in the cruelty and hypocrisy of the world beyond his valley. He had created his own sanctuary, and now it was hers too. She was not a burden he had taken on, but a companion he had found. She felt the weight of the knife at her belt, a constant, reassuring presence. It was a tool, as he had said, but it was also a symbol. It was the moment she had accepted her own agency, her own power to defend herself and the life she was building. She owed him her life, yes, but she had also paid that debt, swinging a hatchet in the dark. They were even, more than even. They were a unit, a family of two, which had become a family of three, bound not by blood, but by shared hardship and mutual respect. He turned his head slightly, his gray eyes meeting hers. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the valley below. It was time to go home. As they walked back down the trail, side by side, Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her, deep and profound. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. There would be other storms, other threats, but she would face them. She was not the words that had been written on her. She was the actions she had taken, the skills she had learned, the strength she had found within herself. She was a survivor, and for the first time since she had watched the dust rise behind the wagon that carried her and Cora away from their farm, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It was not the desperate, fragile hope of a victim, but the quiet, resilient optimism of a woman who had found her place in the world and was ready to build a future, one day, one action, one silent, shared understanding at a time.